Before you die, there is something you should know about us. I am your father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate.
What's that make us?
Absolutely nothing, which is what you are about to become.
Sometimes it's hard to keep a dead man dead. Welcome back to Unraveling, the series where we dissect and analyze the infamous events of years past, and try to figure out just what exactly was even going on in them. When last we checked in on the enigmatic Clone Saga, we just got done going through the original 1970s storyline, featuring the introduction of the clones of both Gwen Stacy and Spider-Man, as well as the psychotic villain, the Jackal. Though the story is concluded, with the Jackal killed by his own scheme, and the identity of the remaining Spider-Man mostly resolved, we still have some things to tackle before we jump into the real attraction. Some with some, how shall we say, unintended impact to our little narrative. Our first major follow-up to the Clone Saga would come to us from Bill Mantlo in issues 25 through 31 of Spectacular Spider-Man. And it starts heavy and fast out of the gate with the introduction of the mysterious new villain, Carrion, a ghastly monster of a man quite unlike we've ever seen before. Carrion has pledged himself to but one single goal, one we're all familiar with, the complete and utter destruction of Spider-Man. Possessing ghastly supernatural abilities and a ferocious anger, Carrion's goal is far more personal than many of his contemporaries, accusing Peter Parker once more of being a murderer, and even more frighteningly is that he already knows who the man beneath the mask really is. Now, beyond his introduction at the start, where he's in the midst of making a deal with the Minutia, for some reason, Carrion plays no part at all in the story told across 25 through 27. Outside of some brief teasers throughout, wherein we see him destroying Peter Parker's apartment, leaving the mysterious calling card of the Dead Walk Parker, he's entirely absent from the story arc. Instead, these three issues largely consist of following the ongoing battle between Spider-Man and the current leader of the Maja crime syndicate, perennial C-lister, the Masked Marauder. During his attempts to stop Big M's lengthy crime spree with his ultimately lame robot bird man bomb thing to ransom the banks or some such shit, Spider-Man is rendered blind by the Marauder's attacks, resulting in Spidey teaming up with the resident expert of blind superheroics, Daredevil, to stop their shared foe and keep the city safe once more. As much as I joke about this story, it's a solidly fun read. While not the most remarkable tale in either hero's catalog, it's a good all-around classic Bronze Age Marvel vehicle. Plenty of quality action and drama throughout, and the entire situation with blind Spidey is both ghastly in the existential implications it brings for the hero, as well as the sheer hilarity it brings seeing our friendly neighborhood drama queen absolutely freak the fuck out about how his superheroing career is over, tantruming back and forth about how his life as he knows it is over and he'll never again be able to do anything good, how everything he worked for as Spider-Man is all for naught, for there's absolutely no way in hell someone who's blind could be a superhero. All which shouted while Daredevil is literally 5 feet away from him. Ironic enjoyment or not, I definitely recommend this little arc. It's a great little overlooked piece of classic Marvel, both narratively and especially artistically, with SSM 27 being one of, if not the first, time the legendary Frank Miller would get his hands on the Man Without Fear. The story instead picks up proper halfway into SSM 28. After stopping the Marauder's dumbass robot from nuking New York, and his eyesight miraculously returning to him, Spidey returns home the following day, with his friends already there, having discovered Carrion's rampage ahead of our hero. Thanks to some well-timed bluffing, Peter is able to get himself out of any suspicion or further danger, and makes plans to meet up with new friend Hector, in reality the hero White Tiger, that night to keep safe from his unwelcome home decorator. Unfortunately, the Parker luck strikes again, and Carrion has already made himself known, and launches after Peter, decrying him as a murderer as he tries to end the life of the wall-crawling menace. As Carrion reveals he knows Peter is Spider-Man, and bizarrely seems to recall facing off with him before, Peter stops pulling his punches and decides to introduce Carrion to the fine furnishings the library has to offer. But this has no effect as Carrion simply makes the weaponized table disintegrate on the spot. Peter tries to stay on the defensive, but an unwelcome guest, a friend of poor, jobbed-out Hector, inadvertently blinds his still sensitive eyes with the lights and gives Carrion a chance to move in for the kill. Peter is able to escape Carrion's deadly grasp for just long enough to get Hector, and his lady friend, a chance to flee. And alone once more, Carrion unleashes his full supernatural arsenal at Peter. Taunting the beaten and weary Parker, Carrion promises him that his death will be truly the most miserable of all, as he chooses to end his assault for the time being, but not before a healthy dose of the vile red death he carries with him. Blinded, again, by the noxious powder, Peter goes careening out the window, only barely recovering in time before White Tiger arrives to do absolutely nothing useful. After a quick stop at the hospital, Peter is already back on his feet and off to investigate, his mind racing to put together the ghoulish puzzle that is Carrion as his body races back to ESU, nearly trampling a silently seething student in the process. But this student, the insignificant Randy, is not all that he seems, as we discover he's in league with Carrion. Sometime later, Peter has decided the best way to find Carrion is to wander aimlessly out and about, literally just hoping he shows up to attack because he's so far tried nothing and he's all out of ideas. White Tiger, deciding of his own volition to shadow Peter for protection, watches our hero putz about intently, but not before he's attacked by some fucking jackass in one of the stupidest looking costumes I've ever seen outside of the 1990s. Seriously, this dude looks like the edgy tactical redesign of fucking Kite Man. Anyways, Darter, by the way, his name's Darter, don't bother remembering, one-shots Tiger with the COD Zombies ray gun, and not even 10 seconds later, Carrion jumps in to attack Peter. Suiting up and swinging into battle, per his request, Spider-Man gets his ass knocked all around campus by Carrion, as Spidey realizes the real reason his foe is so dangerous is that his famed spider sense is utterly useless against him. Carrion taunts Spider-Man for his failings in life and academia, and finally begins to reveal his sinister motive. The decaying demon decries Spider-Man as a murderer, blaming him for the deaths of both his one true love, as well as himself. Naturally, Spidey thinks he's a few nuggies short of 12-piece and calls him on this bullshit, but not before the showdown is interrupted by the B-squad of Darter and White Tiger. The wall crawler takes the confusion caused by their sudden arrival as a chance to press the advantage, and gets Carrion to drop the cryptic ramblings and spill the details. But, unfortunately for Spider-Man, Carrion shows he has quite a bit of ground to stand on with his accusations, revealing that the two victims he seeks revenge for are that of Gwen Stacy and Professor Warren. With the revelation of his dastardly foe's goals, Spidey takes the opportunity to grill Carrion for more information, as he tries to move the heated battle elsewhere. The advantage, however, is short-lived, as the B-Squad's battle spills over into the new venue, creating widespread confusion as everyone starts botching the hell out of their attacks one after the other. That is, until Carrion decides he's just had enough of these shenanigans. The decrepit ghoul doses Spidey with his vile crimson dust, knocking him out and dragging him off to Professor Warren's hidden lab for the final, poetic conclusion. Carrion works quickly to put the final finishing touches on things, ranting and raving to himself of his origin. Declaring himself to be the anti-life, no, not that one. Ugh. That he only lives for that Warren was killed, that he only exists to succeed where the Jackal failed. And as Peter awakens in the lab, Carrion grants him his final request before death, and reveals that he was a clone of Professor Warren all along. The shock wears off on Petey Boy fast though, and he tries to point out to Carrion that Warren only blamed Spider-Man because he was totally nutso crazy, but sadly Carrion happens to be that crazy nutso, so that strategy fails. Carrion explains his birth, that Warren had planned to create a clone copy of himself, for some fucking reason, but his death left the clone unmaintained, continuing to age at an accelerated rate and dying of old age, yet paradoxically left alive by the cloning chamber. It's only thanks to the unfortunate discovery by the aforementioned Randy that Carrion awoke, and realizing the fate of the original Jackal, he appoints the boy his assistant in his tapestry of vengeance, by promising him the power of Spider-Man himself. By which he of course meant give him that shitty-ass starter costume and hope he gets himself killed while I enact my real plan. Said plan being to inject a protoplasmic clone slug with Peter's spider blood, creating some sort of spider amoeba, just roll with it, to kill the web slinger with his own powers in some bizarre idea of poetry. Luckily for Spider-Man, Darter, conveniently listening in to the entire thing, turns on Carrion for his own betrayal, blasting the unliving clone in an attempt to claim vengeance. emphasis on attempt, mind you, as he's immediately doused by Carrion's vile red death, slowly and surprisingly graphically disintegrating on the spot. But his failure doesn't much matter, as his blind firing happens to free Spidey, and another rematch between the two commences as the bizarre spider amoeba watches on, taking the first opportunity to pounce on his genetic descendant. But before Carrion gets a chance to gloat, White Tiger manages to catch up to the fight in progress, inadvertently setting the lab ablaze and immediately bailing on the fight afterwards. Though it is useful as a distraction, and Spider-Man is able to break free of the amoeboid menace and gets it to lock sights onto its creator instead. For some inexplicable, horribly convenient reason, the amoeba is able to nullify all of Carrion's abilities, dragging the two of them deeper into the blazing lab, putting an end to the two disgraces of nature in the all-consuming flames. As the lab continues to burn, Spider-Man escapes with his life intact, fortunate that all remaining evidence of the bizarre situation are taken care of, with no loose ends. This time. Once more, the menace of Professor Warren's madness comes to a close, and Spider-Man earns himself a hard-fought respite from the ills of the world, content that this puts an end to this sordid chapter of his life. The Carrion storyline is a very interesting and somewhat atypical story for the era, and one I find a lot of enjoyment in, though it does falter a bit towards the end, and I won't say it's some unsung classic. I like Carrion conceptually, this malignant force from beyond life and death dedicated to utterly destroying you and you alone, who knows your every secret which it can and will use against you. It's a premise that works shockingly well with Spider-Man and presents a horrifying menace towards our hero unmatched by any previous foe, not even Carrion's originator, the Jackal. My only real complaint with the arc overall comes with the length of it. The story arc overall just isn't long enough in my opinion. I feel that Carrion should have been built up for longer over several more issues in order to better justify his threat. Considering that in the story we get, Carrion does a grand total of one single thing to directly threaten Peter before revealing himself, which doesn't exactly give Peter a whole lot of time to panic or get paranoid, as is the villain's goal. As well, there feels like there's just too much space to fill. This may seem paradoxical, so let me explain. Within the arc we're given of Carrion, half of the issues are dedicated to an entirely unrelated story about Daredevil and the Magia, wherein the villain only has a mild cameo or two beyond his debut. And even within the issues directly focusing on him, we spend far too much time on whatever shit White Tiger is getting up to, or Peter's friends, or the literal who's at ESU. Even discarding the drawn-out fight scenes, which to be fair I rather quite enjoy the majority of, even if everyone jobs harder than Lieutenant Worf usually does, there is a lot of space just not fully utilizing the villain to the potential he has. Also, this one may be divisive, but while the actual reveal of Carrion's true identity is a tad questionably handled in the story, it at least all fits together with both the Jackal's previous MO and what gets set up throughout the arc, even if none of this clone bullshit really explains Carrion's objectively supernatural and non-scientific powers. But you may disagree with me on this one, and that much is fair. Some of you may even be thinking that the reveal of Carrion being a clone of the Jackal is a complete asspull, with no setup, and clearly Carrion was supposed to be someone else. And you may be surprised to know that you aren't the only one to think so. Fellow writer Tony Isabella, on his blog all the way back in 2001, states that Bill Mantlo once told him that the actual original identity of Carrion was in fact meant to be the Spider clone, whose clone body wasn't as perfect as Warren had hoped and had begun to degenerate after spending time in the incinerator smokestack, but managed to escape and plotted his revenge. The plan was initially what was written in the first part of the storyline, but the story received a last-second veto by Marv Wolfman, then writer of ASM, who stated he didn't want there to be a second Spider-Man running around causing havoc and confusion, and being the main Spidey books writer, his decision was considered final. Personally, however, I don't exactly believe this story. There are a few too many holes in that idea, and Isabella brings up a few alleged ideas that don't entirely mesh with what happened in both the Clone Saga and the Carrion arc, which makes the claim rather suspect to me. Now, since it's naturally impossible to ask Bill Mantlo, and considering this all happened nearly 50 fucking years ago, it's safe to assume Wolfman doesn't even remember this happening, we only have Isabella's claim to go on for this, and the entire story he tells has nothing to corroborate his tale, and there are a lot of holes in it which makes it a rather shaky foundation. Now, I'm not outright calling Isabella a liar or saying it never happened, but the overall way it's written comes off very self-serving, and it's clearly written from a post-mortem perspective of the Clone Saga. So personally, I'm gonna disregard the story myself. Even so, the Carrion arc is honestly the least egregious amendment to the Clone Saga we'll have the pleasure to deal with. but one we'll be seeing pop up again rather soon. Speaking of ASM, we're going to make a quick pit stop over there with its own follow-up to Lingering Threads of the Clone Saga. Initially, I wasn't planning on covering this tangent, but when I decided to split up the pre-saga content into 2 videos, I figured I might as well go over it real quick. If you recall the scene at the opening of 151, the spectacular Spider-Man's sensational spider sense sends shivers surging through his synapses, believing that someone is watching as he disposes of his carbon copy, yet dismissing the warnings when he finds nothing there. But Peter Parker's panic proves perfectly valid, as we discover a couple issues later in ASM's number 168 and 169. In the midst of Jameson building yet another Spider Slayer, and some cryptic hints from Robertson, Peter would discover a mysterious envelope that has apparently made Jonah jollier than usual, and after a bout of some friendly neighborhood breaking and entering, he'd discover why. It turns out that Peter was being watched during his disposal of the clone, and his mysterious voyeur snapped some very compromising photos of Spidey in the process. And after his shiny new Spider Slayer gets shit-canned just as they always do, Jameson would move to confront Peter in an attempt to expose his identity. Fortunately, Peter thought ahead, and hastily threw together some fabricated photos using the negatives, and is able to successfully convince Jameson that the compromising photos are themselves fabricated and passing his homemade fakes off as the originals. With Jameson placated and his identity kept safe again, Spidey would celebrate his well-earned luck, though the issue drops the story without resolving who was behind it. During the confrontation, Peter was able to push the blame off onto his old pal Harry Osborn, arguing that he had the access and motive to make them in a scheme for revenge during his time as the Green Goblin. Little does Peter know, however, that he's entirely right with his baseless accusation, and the photos were in fact part of an elaborate scheme concocted by Harry Osborn's psychiatrist Dr. Bart Hamilton, who learned all of Harry's secrets and hypnotized the boy into helping plot his grand plan to usurp the mantle of Green Goblin and seize control of New York's criminal underworld. This, didn't work, and the Goblin would be buried again, along with the lingering story thread. Not the most important thing in the world, for sure, but worth acknowledging nonetheless. I'd also be remiss in not bringing up issue 30 from the first run of What If, featuring the tale of What If Spider-Man's clone lived. It's largely your standard What If setup, with ya boy Uatu recapping the finale of the Clone Saga. However, our story here diverges from the point when Professor Warren breaks free from the mad persona of the Jackal. Rather than team up as originally planned, in our diverted story, one of the Spider-Men sucker punches the other, and saves Ned Leeds just in time, with no risk or harm to either of them. With his doppelganger alive, but unconscious, and the day saved, the remaining Spider-Man returns his double to Warren's lab, throwing him into a spare cloning bed to keep him asleep as he solves the problem. But it quickly becomes evident that Peter here is a few years out of date, physically and mentally, but our confused costume crusader doesn't have the foresight we have, and under the impression he has amnesia, sets across the city to try and piece together his current life. A long, winding road that will lead him back to a hidden chamber in the Jackal's now vacant hideout, where our friendly neighborhood identity crisis comes face to face with the startling reality. He is in fact the clone, born from the genetic sample taken by Warren, and brought to full form, mind and body, as he was when the sample was taken. Even though that completely ignores how the actual story set things up with how the clones and their memories work, but fuck it, this is What If, not coherent continuity tales, who really cares? Cloney Boy tries his best to pick up the place the real Peter Parker left vacant because of the clone, mind you, from balancing the college life far beyond his experience, as well as trying to hold his own against the Kingpin. But it ultimately proves too much, and the clone chooses instead to reawaken the one true Spider-Man, and the two join forces to take down Kingpin. With the real Peter returned, the clone reconciles with him and decides to leave town, but Peter convinces him to stay, and the tale ends with the two Peters choosing to share their lives, setting up arrangements for who plays what role when as proverbial brothers. While it's hardly the most remarkable story, honestly just fairly average by What If standards, it is rather humorous how close it ends up being to where the Clone Saga ends up going. While, allegedly, written as a satirical dig at fans who insisted the Spider-Clone could have lived alongside the original, it actually does set up a rather intriguing, if not convoluted, situation for our hero that, with a few tweaks, could have worked, and indeed they later would do exactly that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, naturally. Unfortunately, the fun must come to an end, and we must now discuss the single biggest hurdle of the Clone Saga, an utterly unnecessary addition to the story that would become an almost unshakable problem point for a good chunk of its run. The 8th annual issue of Spectacular Spider-Man as part of the Evolutionary War. The Evolutionary War, for those not familiar, was Marvel's 1988 crossover event. The general synopsis of the story focuses around the machinations of the High Evolutionary, who had returned after a lengthy absence to enact his grand plan to push human evolution into overdrive and create a perfect race of beings. Spider-Man's role in that grand epic is rather quite minimal, honestly, at least in regards to the greater narrative of it. Our focus instead centers around the return of that pesky little clone of Gwen Stacy, who's currently caught the eye of the High Evolutionary. Set up in SSM 142 and 143, during Spidey's first battle against Tombstone, we discovered that Gwen's clone has been living out life as a high school teacher out in Michigan. But her carefully crafted new life crumbles to pieces when the High Evolutionary's goons go out on the prowl for her for reasons unknown. Without any hesitation, Gwen sets a course back for New York, believing that whatever might be happening, Peter will have the answers. Unfortunately, Gwen's first reunion back in New York happens to be with Spider-Man, making things worse for her mental state. Totally inconsiderate since the web-slinging cretin helps rescue her without even knowing it was Gwen. Petey Boy still got some hang-ups despite what he might have said back then, and seeing Gwen return has put him into quite a foul mood. And MJ's not exactly all that thrilled about it either. And of course, neither is Gwen, who, equally freaked the hell out after all this, rushes over to talk to Peter. But nothing can ever be so simple, as the once comforting presence of Peter is shattered when she discovers his identity as Spider-Man, forcing our friendly neighborhood nightmare creator to rush out after her, and getting the two captured by the High Evolutionary's goons for good measure. While all of this is going on, the ongoing plot of the event is in the works, with the High Evolutionary traveling to the distant reaches of the cosmos to investigate a pet theory of his, relating to the incredible potential of humanity's future he learned of long ago, a band of warriors called the Young Gods. Marvel's Young Gods, who are definitely for short, not at all similar to DC's New Gods, no siree, not at all, there's not one bit of overlap. First and foremost, people actually care about the New Gods. Okay, jokes aside, the quick version is that the Young Gods were a group of 12 warriors from 12 different cultures, chosen by their people's gods and assembled by Gaia to serve as proof of mankind's highest levels of potential. Given as tribute to spare Earth from judgment by the Celestials, these Young Gods were taken to distant stars to be mentored in efforts to mold them into the next generation of gods. Nothing, of course, can be done to teach them how not to be so insufferably boring. Now, in the let me see. Let me check my notes here. Yes, 8 years since their debut, the Young Gods have done just about absolutely fucking nothing. In fact, all they've seemed to have done in the universe is play grab ass on their big spaceship, waiting around to be useful. And since this is the first time we've even seen these clowns since they first showed up, we have to deal with the usual barrage of introductions. And most of the Young Gods are either non-existent cardboard cutouts, and if they're not casually bringing up their nationalities, then they're walking stereotypes of them. A very special spotlight on Brightsword, the team's Israeli representative, who interrupts a conversation he wasn't a part of, just to make sure everybody remembers the Holocaust was a bad thing. Why exactly the High Evolutionary assumes these clowns are of any relevance to his plans is a mystery to us, and seems to be a mystery to him as well, since the second he starts watching them he decides that he's wasting his time, and bids his farewell after being accidentally caught peeping on them. This is, of course, a grievous offense to a faction of the Young Gods, who decide to follow the High Evolutionary back to Earth and beat him up. Okay, I guess to be fair, they do conveniently read his entire life history from his mind in like a second and find out he's evil, but they straight up state he isn't their problem to deal with in the slightest, but who cares? The scene basically plays out as,
"Whoops, sorry everyone, apologies for interrupting, just doing a bit of research, didn't mean to intrude, so I'm gonna be on my way now."
And in response, the Young Gods decide,
Okay, let's go over there and destroy the place.
And how fortunate that they arrive at just the same time Spider-Man does, immediately tearing into the High Evolutionary's goons and trashing the joint as Spidey fights to rescue Gwen, rigged up to some bizarre experiment as the High Evolutionary nonchalantly watches the chaos unfurl. Eventually, the other young gods arrive to beat up their teammates for being a bunch of morons. The fight gets violent but is ultimately brief, and after one of the team is severely wounded, the big dumb battle is put to an end. And good timing on their part, as Spider-Man is able to free Gwen from the experiment, as well as finally able to put his feelings for her away. Unsurprisingly, the young gods refuse to explain literally anything that just happened, and leave just as abruptly as they arrived. And the High Evolutionary is feeling quite a lack of hospitable spirit and tells Spidey to fuck off just the same. But Spidey wants some answers first, and unfortunately, the High Evolutionary is all too keen to give them. High Evolutionary reveals the reason he wanted Gwen was to discover just how a mid-tier biology professor like Professor Warren unlocked the secret to cloning with the perfect instant duplicate of Gwen Stacy. And much to our shock and horror, he plainly states he didn't. Gwen Stacy is not, and has never been, a clone, but instead an unknown and unfortunate victim of Warren's madness, modified with a unique genetic virus to be a near-exact copy of Gwen, but not completely exact. While Gwen begins to break down at this news, her life once again shattered so soon, this crisis is averted when one of the young gods arrives and, as a favor, restores Gwen to her original form and memory, and the mysterious woman who once was Gwen returns to her own life, and Spider-Man is confident this chapter of his life is closed with a last loving embrace with Mary Jane. But oh good God almighty, how I wish it was. I don't think I really need to point out just how severely this story fucks up the Clone Saga as a concept, both the original and basically everything we've got left to go over. And believe me, there is still a lot more to go through, folks. This little retcon creates a massive headache for us going through the Clone Saga. One that doesn't leave for quite some time. So unfortunately, we're just kind of stuck with it hanging over us for a solid chunk of the story going forward. Now, right about now, you're going to ask, what in the actual fuck was Conway smoking with this idea? And we do actually have an answer to this. See, way back in the 1980s, several prominent scientific minds began to believe cloning, in the sense of creating a living copy of something from its own cells, was not scientifically possible in any way. Conway, having been convinced by these articles, chose to once again inject realism into the Marvel Universe, and undo the work of the Jackal to better reflect reality. This is of course ignoring the fact that cloning had been well established as a thing in the Marvel Universe for decades by then, and that he thought Warren creating a genetic retrovirus that completely and near perfectly transformed someone into an exact copy of Gwen Stacy was somehow more fucking realistic than him just cloning her ass. Also, for those keeping track at home, the first successful living clones would be born about 4 or 5 years after the story was published, making the entire ordeal, say it with me, entirely pointless. Suffice it to say that one way or another, we're stuck with this retcon for now, and we'll just have to hope it doesn't make things too complicated. You may also be asking right now, wait a second, if Gwen Stacy wasn't really a clone, then who the hell was Spider-Man's clone? And furthermore, who in the actual fuck was Carrion? Well, Conway was already ahead of us there, and we'd get our answer just a few issues later, in SSM 149. Peter, busy as ever failing at college, has finally decided to answer this question for himself. Breaking into the remains of Warren's hidden lab at ESU, conveniently left totally untouched and undisturbed by the police since the fire, to investigate for a proper answer to the enigma he's been dealt. To his incredible convenience, Peter would find exactly what he was looking for, a hidden journal penned by the professor, dating only a few days before enacting his scheme. The journal would reveal that everything the High Evolutionary told our wall-crawling hero was the truth. Neither Gwen nor Peter were ever cloned. Elaborating on the true nature of Warren's obsession with Gwen, revealing he was deeply romantically in love with her as opposed to his previous statements, the professor would one day discover Peter's secret identity by pure happenstance, and blaming both man and Spider-Man equally, began his great revenge plot. Gwen was in reality a fellow student of his named Joyce Delaney. Peter was instead Warren's presumed dead assistant, Anthony Serba. both taken and subjected to an elaborate gene virus to create convincing duplicates of the two. This virus is further expanded to detail the origin of Carrion, revealing the mysterious foe to have been created by hyper-enhanced samples of Warren's own DNA, half alive, yet half dead, as unfortunately revealed firsthand with Peter's classroom rival Malcolm McBride, discovering the last remaining sample of the virus in Warren's lab and accidentally infecting himself with it, transforming him into a brand new Carrion. So you may be wondering then, who was the first Carrion? Well, you see, shut the fuck up. This new Carrion, believing himself to be the one and only, and a true blue clone, same as the original, sets out to dispatch Spider-Man, though less theatrically than his predecessor. But this new Carrion has no new tricks in his book to shock the wall crawler and is handily dispatched, hauled off to holding in the vault. At some point after, Spidey would discover Carrion's new identity, and worked with the world's most useless scientist, Reed Richards, to discover a cure. This fantastic brand cure would never come to be, however, as Carrion is busted free from imprisonment by the Hobgoblin, who forms an allegiance with Carrion to get revenge against Spidey, who raided the lab to give Carrion the truth about his reality and drive him deeper into despair. Their team-up, as always with villains, is short-lived, as Spidey would be able to turn Carrion's misery against him to get him to turn against Hobgoblin, sacrificing himself to save McBride's mother after Hobgoblin begins targeting her. Throughout the team-up, Carrion's powers would be further demystified, once again, thanks to Conway, rewriting his supernatural abilities to be more mundane. Well, except the death touch, that's basically still an evil death touch, but you can't really make that mundane, now can you? Anyways, this second Carrion would survive this, returning during the infamous event Maximum Carnage, where he would join Carnage's army of villains, but thanks to the combined efforts of Spidey and his allies, McBride would finally be cured of the malignant Carrion virus, and, eventually, losing the virus altogether in ASM 393. When fellow Team Carnage member Shriek uses her powers to transfer the virus from McBride into herself, or, I don't know, fucking love or some shit, I don't really care, does it matter? And on that note, my wonderful viewer, this finally puts us exactly where we need to be to start delving into the Clone Saga. There are, of course, quite a number of other things that happen between the two sagas that influence events, both chronologically and in real-world time, but we'll tackle those as they come in the saga proper. But as for the lingering threads left behind by the original, we're all nice and neatly tied up. And how fortunate too, as this conclusion of the Carrion affair gives us an incredible amount of time to let the first Clone Saga settle for memory, as between 393 and the official start of the Clone Saga we have a whopping, 3 weeks? Fuck me, man, this is gonna be a bigger headache than I thought. Even before starting the Clone Saga, do the problems that plague it become apparent. Bloated with pointless story tangents and littered with clumsy retcons on top of clumsy retcons, as the years go on, this tapestry of continuity becomes an ever-tangled mess. And while a lot of blame can be placed at Conway for his decisions, even going from the conclusion of the Clone Saga, even though Archie Goodwin wrote that last issue, but I digress, but at the same time many of these issues were written in fundamentally different times. The idea of a story from 10 to 15 years, or even longer before, being dredged up wasn't really a thing yet. Still, had Conway not gotten a stick up his ass and let the story lie, we wouldn't have been in as bad a situation as we are starting off. And trust me when I say, things only get more confusing from here on. But we're not jumping into that just yet. For now, we're returning back to regular programming, and we'll check back in with the wacky clone fun times at another point. Thank you all very much for watching, and we'll be back sometime soon.